In early May 1942, the Coral Sea shimmered under a hard Pacific sun as two massive naval forces prepared to clash in what would become the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. Yet amid this grand confrontation, a smaller story, quiet, almost invisible, began to unfold. It was the story of 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers that lifted off from the deck of the USS Yorktown and never returned. Their fate would remain one of the Pacific War's enduring mysteries. The morning of May 7th began with urgency. Japanese invasion forces were advancing toward Port Moresby, and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17, needed precise reconnaissance. Every plane mattered. The skies were crowded with SBD Dauntless dive bombers, F-4F Wildcats, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Fragile, slow, and obsolete even by 1942 standards, but still the backbone of the fleet's strike arm. Shortly after 0900 hours, 5 TBD-1 Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 5, VT-5, were ordered to scout the area east of the Louisiade Archipelago. Their leader, Lieutenant Harold "Hal" Stevens, a decorated pilot with 600 hours of flight experience, acknowledged the orders with calm professionalism. His final radio message before departure was brief. "Yorktown, this is Baker 5. Rolling now." The planes lifted into the wind and vanished into the horizon. The Devastator was not a forgiving aircraft. Built for slow, low-level torpedo runs, it was a death trap against modern fighters and unreliable in rough weather. Each carried a single Mark 13 torpedo and enough fuel for barely 4 hours of flight. Their mission: locate the reported Japanese carrier force believed to be operating south of New Guinea. They were not to engage, only observe and report. As the formation climbed toward the cloud deck, conditions worsened. Tropical storms rolled in from the southeast, obscuring visibility to less than a mile. The radio chatter grew tense. A few garbled words made it back to Yorktown: cloud cover thick, fuel low, no contact. Then, silence. Hours passed. By mid-afternoon, the air group officer began to realize something was wrong. Other squadrons returned, battered but intact. No sign of Stevens' section. The Yorktown's radar, primitive and erratic, showed no trace of the missing aircraft. The sea below was dotted with rain squalls and whitecaps, a graveyard for downed flyers. Admiral Fletcher ordered immediate search operations. At dawn the next morning, PBY Catalina flying boats from the 11th Patrol Squadron began sweeping the area east of Misima Island. For 2 days they flew grid after grid, guided by compass and dead reckoning. Once, a Catalina reported a thin line of oil slick stretching across the surface, too faint to follow, but enough to fuel hope. Still, the search turned up nothing. No wreckage, no rafts, no distress flares. The Navy logged the loss as missing, presumed lost at sea. The official report would later estimate their disappearance occurred at approximately 10 degrees south, 153 degrees east. But even that coordinate was uncertain, derived from an incomplete flight plan and rough radio bearings. The mystery deepened as word spread among the fleet. Some pilots whispered that the Devastators had strayed into a Japanese trap. Others suggested mechanical failure or a navigational error carried them too far west, toward the mountainous jungles of Papua. A few men aboard Yorktown claimed they saw a flash on the horizon just before radio silence. Perhaps lightning, perhaps something else. In his private journal, Ensign Paul Richter, one of the last pilots to see the formation, wrote, "They flew low and tight. Hal waved once. I think he knew the risk." The weather turned cruel fast. It's strange how quiet it felt when they were gone. His entry captured what official reports could not: the quiet grief of men who had seen comrades vanish without a trace. By the time the Yorktown and Lexington engaged the Japanese carrier Shoho days later, the missing bombers were already forgotten by most. The battle raged above and below the clouds, changing the course of the Pacific War, but somewhere in that vast sea, 5 Devastators lay hidden beneath the waves. The loss was small compared to the scale of the battle, yet it lingered like an unanswered question. Why did they vanish so completely? Even in an ocean of wrecks, most left some trace: a wing, a raft, a body. But for Stevens and his men, there was nothing. Historians later noted that their disappearance was recorded just hours before the Yorktown received the crucial intelligence that would turn the tide of the engagement. Some began to wonder if the missing flight had seen something, perhaps a Japanese fleet position or radio signal, that was never reported. For the families back home, telegrams arrived in the usual Navy phrasing: missing in action, presumed lost. No explanation, no closure. Just the war's cold arithmetic. As the Coral Sea grew calm again and the fleets withdrew, the last entry in the Yorktown's logbook for May 7 read simply, VT5, Section 3, no further contact. A line of ink across a page, marking the beginning of one of the Pacific's quietest, most enduring mysteries. The sea had taken them, or something had. And as night fell over the Coral Sea, the only witnesses were the waves themselves, whispering over the place where 5 brave airmen disappeared without a trace. The day after the devastators vanished, the mood aboard the USS Yorktown was heavy but focused. The ship's crew had no time to mourn, the battle was still raging, and the Coral Sea was an unforgiving theater. Yet as radio operators replayed the final transmissions from Lieutenant Stevens' flight, a quiet unease began to spread through the fleet. The words, "fuel low, cloud cover thick," were all they had, fragments of a mystery that refused to fade. Admiral Fletcher's staff ordered an expanded search effort. Patrol planes from Task Force 44, including Australian Hudson bombers out of Port Moresby, joined the hunt. The vast ocean between the Louisiade Archipelago and Rossell Island became a grid of invisible lines drawn across the sea, each one a flight path for weary pilots scanning the endless blue. By the second day, the search had covered over 12,000 square miles, with nothing to show for it but frustration and exhaustion. For the airmen flying these search missions, the danger was constant. Tropical squalls erupted without warning, tossing even large patrol craft like corks in the wind. One pilot, Lieutenant James O'Connor of Patrol Squadron 11, wrote in his diary, "Visibility 2 miles. Rain thick as oil. Radio unreliable. If those boys went down out here, they never stood a chance." His entry was later recovered from Navy archives, one of the few first-hand reflections on the doomed search. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft from the carrier Shokoku were still prowling the skies. Several PBY Catalinas searching for the missing Americans came under attack, forcing them to break off and retreat to their base in Townsville, Australia. Each encounter with enemy planes reminded the rescuers that they were searching not in peace, but in the middle of a battlefield. Every hour spent looking for the lost bombers was an hour closer to another ambush. Then, on May 9th, came a flicker of hope. A reconnaissance crew aboard a Lexington-based SBD Dauntless reported an odd shimmer on the ocean surface southeast of Misima Island. At first, they thought it was sunlight on the waves. But as they passed lower, they saw what looked like metallic debris, small, scattered, and half-submerged. Before they could confirm, the weather closed in again, and the pilot was forced to turn back. When the same coordinates were checked the next morning, the sea was empty once more. Rumors spread quickly through the fleet. Some claimed the debris was part of the missing devastators. Others whispered it was wreckage from a Japanese reconnaissance plane shot down days earlier. Even the intelligence staff couldn't agree. Lieutenant Commander Rowe, the Yorktown's air officer, noted in his log, "Possible contact with unidentified aircraft remains. No confirmation. Area to be rechecked post-engagement." It never was. As days turned into weeks, theories began to multiply. One suggestion was navigational drift, that the formation had been pushed hundreds of miles off course by the Coral Sea's unpredictable winds. Another theory, whispered only in the wardrooms, was that the bombers had been intercepted by enemy fighters operating from Rabaul and never had the chance to radio for help. But there was no evidence, no wreckage, and no Japanese report to confirm such an engagement. Aboard the USS Lexington, pilot George Cook later recalled in an interview decades afterward, "There were nights you'd look out across the sea and see flashes in the distance. Lightning, maybe, or ships firing. After a while, you couldn't tell which. The ocean swallowed everything." His words reflected a truth that every sailor and pilot in the Coral Sea came to understand. Sometimes, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese. It was the sea itself. Back in Pearl Harbor, Navy analysts reviewed every transmission, every navigational chart, every report from Task Force 17. The last verified radio contact placed the bombers about 80 miles southeast of Rossell Island, an area later mapped as Sector G12. When hydrographic teams reviewed it after the war, they found the seabed there dropped sharply, plunging to depths of nearly 18,000 feet. Even with today's technology, recovery at that depth would be nearly impossible. Despite the official conclusion, aircraft lost in action, the story continued to gnaw at those who had known the men. Lieutenant Harold Stevens' bunk was never reassigned during the remainder of the Yorktown's deployment. His flight jacket, still hanging in the locker, became an unspoken shrine for the pilots who survived the Coral Sea. For historians, this disappearance became more than a wartime anecdote. It was a case study in the limits of early naval aviation, the fragile link between man, machine, and the vast unknown. "We were still learning how to fight an ocean war," wrote naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison years later. And sometimes, the ocean fought back. Even after the Yorktown moved north to face its fate at Midway, the question lingered: where had those 5 aircraft gone? The Coral Sea was littered with wrecks, yet none matched the missing planes. For the sailors who sailed through those waters in the years that followed, stories circulated of strange oil sheens and reflections beneath the surface, always just out of reach, always vanishing when approached. And so the mystery remained: a handful of missing men, a handful of unanswered signals, and a patch of sea that refused to give up its dead. The fleet moved on, but the silence of those 5 aircraft echoed in every empty sky. Somewhere beneath the waves, the Coral Sea kept its secret, waiting, as if it knew the war was not yet finished with it. When the guns of the Coral Sea finally fell silent, the U.S. Navy's focus shifted to Midway, but not everyone was ready to let go of the unanswered questions left behind. Among the war's many after-action reports, one stood out: the disappearance of Lieutenant Harold Stevens and his squadron. What began as a tactical footnote soon drew the attention of naval intelligence. The loss of 5 aircraft in clear weather, within known coordinates, without enemy contact, it didn't add up. By June 1942, investigators at Pearl Harbor's Fleet Intelligence Center began reviewing the Yorktown's communication logs. What they found was a tangle of inconsistencies. Radio timestamps didn't match flight plans. Direction-finding bearings conflicted between the Yorktown and the Lexington. Even more curious, one of the last entries in the Yorktown's operations log, possible interference on Channel 3, had been quietly crossed out in pencil. The officer who made the correction, Lieutenant Commander Rowe, later claimed he didn't remember why. Analysts suspected that the squadron's radios might have suffered from jamming. The Japanese Navy, it turned out, had been experimenting with limited radio deception at the time, crude, but sometimes effective. Their reconnaissance seaplanes, launched from small tenders operating near New Guinea, could mimic American call signs to lure patrol aircraft off course. If Stevens' formation had followed a false signal, they might have flown far beyond their designated grid without realizing it. In a post-war interview, communications officer Ensign Robert Hale recalled, "We heard static on the band that morning unlike anything I'd heard before. It wasn't weather. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Then the devastators were gone." Hale's testimony, declassified decades later, became one of the first clues suggesting early forms of electronic interference, a concept few understood in 1942 but one that would later shape modern warfare. For naval historians, this discovery was groundbreaking. The Battle of the Coral Sea was already a turning point, the first time opposing fleets fought without ever siding one another directly. But the idea that unseen electronic warfare might have played a role in the disappearance of American aircraft added a darker layer to the story. It revealed just how fragile communications had been in those early days of carrier warfare, and how little protection aircrews had against manipulation of their own signals. Still, official reports avoided speculation. The Bureau of Aeronautics concluded tersely, probable loss due to weather and navigational failure. No mention of interference, no admission of possible deception. The Navy was reluctant to expose any weakness that could embolden the enemy or unsettle the public. Stevens' flight became one more wartime secret buried in classified archives. Meanwhile, surviving pilots from VT-5 continued to talk. During a reunion in San Diego in 1948, one veteran claimed he'd seen an unidentified aircraft shadowing Stevens Formation shortly after takeoff, a twin-float seaplane, possibly Japanese. He had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was friendly. But as the story resurfaced years later, it fueled speculation that the missing flight may have been intercepted or misled before ever reaching its search area. The tragedy also exposed another problem: the inadequate record-keeping of carrier operations under combat conditions. The Yorktown's deck log was incomplete, and key details from May 7th, including fuel loads, takeoff times, and radio channels, were lost when the carrier was sunk at Midway a month later. What survived were fragments, letters, personal notes, and scraps of intelligence memos, each offering a glimpse into what might have happened, but never the whole truth. One memo, signed by Commander Joseph Rockefort, the brilliant codebreaker behind the Midway victory, mentioned the Coral Sea losses in passing. Possible enemy attempt to mask frequencies in Sector G. Results inconclusive. It was the only official hint that electronic deception might have been involved. Rockefort's note was buried in the Navy's archives for nearly 50 years before being rediscovered by historians in the 1990s. Looking back, the disappearance of the 5 devastators was more than a mystery. It was a warning. The Coral Sea had shown the Navy how vulnerable its operations were to confusion, interference, and the sheer unpredictability of the ocean. The lessons learned would quietly influence the development of more secure communication systems, radar homing devices, and coordinated search protocols used later in the war. Yet the men themselves, Stevens, Dalton, Pierce, Harrington, and Lewis, were never found. Their names were engraved on the tablets of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, but no wreckage was ever identified as theirs. For all the intelligence analysis and technical speculation, the ocean remained silent. As one naval historian wrote years later, wars are fought in 3 dimensions: land, air, and sea, but the fourth is silence. And in that silence, truth can drown. The Coral Sea's silence had claimed 5 aircraft, 5 crews, and perhaps a secret no one was ever meant to uncover. But history rarely stays buried forever. In time, a discovery thousands of miles away, by divers searching for something else entirely, would breathe new life into the mystery of the lost bombers of the Coral Sea. 3 decades after the guns of the Coral Sea went silent, a small team of Australian divers set out on what was meant to be a routine expedition. The year was 1973, and the South Pacific had become a graveyard of forgotten steel. Oil company surveys and amateur explorers were beginning to map the ocean floor, revealing shipwrecks long hidden beneath the waves. But near the Louisiade archipelago, divers stumbled upon something no one expected: fragments of an American aircraft, aluminum twisted and coral-encrusted, marked faintly with stars and bars. The discovery was made by a group from the Royal Australian Navy's Hydrographic Service, operating out of Townsville. Their sonar readings had shown an anomaly about 200 miles southeast of Papua New Guinea, near the same coordinates once listed in the Yorktown's lost flight report. When the first dive team descended, they found part of a wing section and what appeared to be the remnants of a radial engine. Nearby lay scattered .30 caliber ammunition and what looked like a pilot's oxygen mask. It was an extraordinary find, yet also a puzzle. When the wreckage was brought to the surface, the serial numbers told a different story. The fragments did belong to an American plane, but not to the Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 5. The bureau number, Buno, etched into the metal traced back to a different carrier, the USS Hornet. According to Navy archives, that aircraft had been lost in 1943, hundreds of miles away from where it was now found. The coordinates simply didn't make sense. Local newspapers caught the story first. Headlines in the Courier Mail read, "U.S. Navy bomber found in Coral Sea. Identity disputed." Veterans groups quickly took notice, urging the U.S. Navy to send investigators. Within weeks, a small American liaison team arrived from Pearl Harbor to verify the findings. They photographed the site, collected samples, and interviewed the divers. Then, quietly, they sealed the records. By 1974, the official statement from the U.S. Navy was brief and dismissive. insufficient evidence to confirm connection to any known wartime loss. The case was closed as quickly as it had opened. But among the divers and historians who had been there, that explanation never sat right. The location matched too closely to the search grids plotted in 1942. The debris bore markings consistent with early war devastators, not the later Avengers used by the Hornet. Some suspected a clerical error, others something more deliberate. The truth was buried beneath layers of conflicting reports and bureaucracy. One of the divers, Peter Callahan, later recalled in a 1989 interview, "We were told to stop asking questions. They said the Americans didn't want old ghosts stirred up. But I know what I saw. Those parts were from an early model torpedo bomber. No doubt in my mind." His account, though anecdotal, reignited public curiosity about the missing flight of 1942. At the same time, declassification of wartime records under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act revealed gaps in Yorktown's operational archives. Log entries for May 7 had missing pages. Fuel records for VT-5 were incomplete. And, most curiously, the coordinates of Stevens' flight sector were redacted even in documents released to historians. Why would a 30-year-old reconnaissance mission still be partly classified? For some researchers, the answer lay in the Cold War context. By the 1970s, the U.S. Navy was still operating in the Pacific, often using wartime wrecks as navigational or training markers. The re-emergence of a mysterious wartime loss, possibly tied to a covert reconnaissance order, could have embarrassed officials or revealed still sensitive methods of intelligence gathering. The simplest path was silence. Meanwhile, the Coral Sea itself continued to guard its secrets. Storms reshaped the seabed, shifting wreckage from one location to another. Marine growth devoured metal, and the ocean's currents erased all human traces. In 1981, a second dive expedition returned to the same site with improved sonar, but the wreckage had vanished, swept away by time and tide. Still, for historians, that fleeting discovery carried weight. It suggested that something, or someone, had been there. Whether it was one of Stevens' missing devastators or another aircraft entirely, it proved that the Navy's own records were incomplete. The ocean, once again, had revealed just enough to remind the world of what it had taken. As one Australian officer put it in his after-action summary, "The sea is generous with mystery but stingy with answers." The case returned to the archives, but whispers continued in the background. Some believed the Navy had quietly recovered parts of the wreck and buried the findings to protect wartime secrets. Others saw it as a bureaucratic mishap, a tragic coincidence amplified by wishful thinking. Yet, when the U.S. Navy's 1990s declassifications began, researchers noticed something extraordinary. Buried in a set of intelligence files labeled Coral Sea Reconnaissance, Restricted, there was mention of an unrecorded flight launched from Yorktown on the same morning Stevens' squadron vanished. Its mission profile was marked simply, Special Observation. No details, no pilot names, no outcomes. And so the question resurfaced: were the lost bombers really on a routine patrol, or were they part of a mission that history was never meant to record? When the Cold War finally thawed and the U.S. government began releasing long-sealed World War II documents in the early 1990s, historians combed through the files hoping to fill long-standing gaps in the record. Among the countless pages of declassified material from the Navy's Pacific archives, one small folder labeled Coral Sea VT Operations, May 7, 1942, Restricted, drew particular attention. Inside were mission outlines, radio transcripts, and a handful of intelligence memos, all referencing a reconnaissance flight that had never appeared in official wartime reports. The documents told a startling story. Hours before the disappearance of Lieutenant Harold Stevens' flight, the Yorktown's air operations had received an urgent dispatch from Fleet Headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The message, signed by a junior intelligence officer, ordered an unscheduled reconnaissance toward the Solomon Sea. The target was not the Japanese carrier force everyone expected, but a suspected convoy of fast transports, possibly carrying supplies or special equipment. The coordinates matched an area that Stevens' section could have reached if they'd flown slightly off their assigned path. What made the file remarkable was what wasn't there. The section labeled Mission Outcome was blank. The Navy had evidently logged the order but never followed up on it. And attached to the folder was a handwritten note, unsigned, written in pencil, that read, "Do not circulate until confirmation of sightings. Sensitive cargo believed aboard convoy." No further details were given. This discovery cast the 1942 disappearance in a new light. Far from a routine scouting mission, the 5 missing devastators may have been diverted to investigate a Japanese shipment that intelligence deemed too important to ignore. Some historians theorize it may have been linked to Japan's early radar research or to plans for the construction of airfields in the Solomons, crucial steps toward their push on Port Moresby. Naval historian Dr. Elaine Carter, one of the first to review the documents, remarked, "This wasn't an accident of navigation. They were sent into an area deliberately outside their coverage zone. Whether they volunteered or were redirected mid-flight, they were chasing something the Navy didn't want publicized." For veterans of the Yorktown, the revelation was bittersweet. Many had long suspected that Stevens' squadron had been tasked with something extraordinary, a mission perhaps never meant to be acknowledged. It explained the missing radio records, the incomplete logbooks, and even the abrupt closure of the 1970s diving investigation. In 1995, the U.S. Naval Historical Center quietly amended its Coral Sea archives, adding a footnote acknowledging an unconfirmed secondary reconnaissance flight possibly involving VT-5 personnel. The correction was buried deep within a 300-page document, unnoticed by the public for years. Only after the release of several oral histories in the early 2000s did the story gain new life. One of those oral histories came from a man named Ensign Peter "Red" Darnell, who had served as an assistant radio officer aboard the Yorktown. In a taped interview, he recalled overhearing a coded exchange between air operations and one of the missing bombers shortly before they vanished. "I remember Stevens' voice clear as day," Darnell said. "He reported visual contact with ships, 2, maybe 3, but before he could give bearings, his signal just broke apart. It was like someone cut the line." If Darnell's memory was accurate, it meant the lost flight had found what they were looking for, but never lived to report it. Theories multiplied. Some argued that Stevens' bombers had stumbled into an enemy convoy escorted by fighters and been shot down before they could escape. Others suggested the planes were intercepted by Japanese float planes operating from the tender Kimikawa Maru, known to be patrolling the same sector that morning. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, a covert reconnaissance gone wrong, silenced by the chaos of battle and the vastness of the sea. Modern analysts see in the episode an early example of how intelligence secrecy can obscure sacrifice. Those 5 crews were officially recorded as lost due to combat operations. But if the 1990s documents are to be believed, they were carrying out an order that no one was meant to discuss. As one researcher put it, they weren't just looking for ships, they were looking for answers the Navy didn't want the world to have. The lesson resonates even today. Military operations, even in wartime, often balance truth against necessity. Records are rewritten, missions erased, and lives folded into the shadows of classification. What remains are the questions, and the courage of those who followed orders without ever knowing what they were truly part of. As historians revisited the Coral Sea mystery with this new information, attention turned once more to the ocean floor. If these aircraft were truly lost pursuing a secret target, their final resting place might hold more than wreckage, it might hold proof. And so, in the early 2000s, a new generation of explorers began to search the Coral Sea again. This time, they carried sonar, deep-sea submersibles, and a determination to finish what the war had left unfinished. They hoped to find not just metal and memory, but the truth. 80 years after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the mystery of the lost bombers still refuses to rest. The sea that swallowed Lieutenant Harold Stevens and his men remains vast and silent, yet modern technology has begun to whisper back. In recent years, a handful of expeditions have set out to locate the wreckage, armed with tools the Navy of 1942 could never have imagined. Deep-sea drones, side-scan sonar, and remotely operated submersibles capable of reaching depths of 20,000 feet. The renewed effort began in 2019, when an Australian-American team led by the Coral Sea Maritime Heritage Project mapped a stretch of seabed near Rossell Island. What they found startled everyone: a debris field roughly matching the shape and spacing of multiple aircraft, each about 40 feet long. Corroded engines, partial fuselage frames, and torpedo remains suggested the site was from early war U.S. Navy models, possibly TBD Devastators. But before they could confirm, a powerful cyclone struck the area, forcing the team to suspend operations. When they returned months later, sediment had shifted, covering much of what they had seen. Still, the sonar images told a compelling story. The planes had gone down in tight formation, too close together to be the result of random crashes. It appeared as though Stevens' squadron had been flying low and close, perhaps attempting a coordinated torpedo run or evading enemy fire. The pattern suggested they had been intact until the very end, a haunting sign of discipline amid disaster. Families of the missing airmen followed these developments with cautious hope. For them, the search wasn't about uncovering military secrets but about closure. Many of their letters and diaries had survived the decades. One note, written by Stevens to his wife the night before the battle, read, "If we meet the enemy tomorrow, know that we'll give them hell, and if we don't come back, well, we'll be together in calmer skies." It was a line that echoed across generations. As word spread, interest from historians and naval authorities grew. The U.S. Navy partnered with Australian researchers to verify the coordinates. The expedition's leader, Dr. Mark Rainsford, described the find as the strongest lead yet in solving the Coral Sea mystery. But without physical confirmation, a visible serial number, a tail marking, or a readable identification plate, no one could say for certain that these were Stevens' lost Devastators. The ocean, as always, guarded the final word. For modern observers, the story of the lost bombers has taken on a deeper meaning. It is no longer just a wartime mystery but a reflection of how history itself can vanish, buried under waves of secrecy, technology, and time. The Coral Sea was the first battle fought entirely by aircraft carriers, and its lessons shaped every naval engagement that followed. Yet amid the grand strategies and statistics, 5 aircraft slipped from the record, leaving behind only questions. Naval historian Dr. Carter, who helped bring the 1990s documents to light, summarized it best: "Every war leaves behind its ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, but the missing pages, the quiet omissions, the stories that don't fit the report. Those are the ghosts that still haunt the archives." In recent years, underwater drones have captured faint metallic echoes near the site first mapped in 2019, just enough to suggest that something rests there still. The team plans to return, weather permitting, with a new generation of sonar that might finally pierce the Coral Sea's silence. But even if they find the wrecks, one question will remain unanswered: what mission had sent those men to their fate, and what had they seen before they disappeared? Today, a small memorial stands on the cliffs of Queensland, facing east toward the open ocean. It bears the names of 5 airmen from Torpedo Squadron 5 and the inscription, "Lost in action, but not forgotten." Each year, on the anniversary of the battle, veterans and families gather there to watch the sunrise over the sea that still hides the truth. As the light spreads across the horizon, the waves catch it and turn gold, just as they must have on that morning in May 1942, when 5 Devastators lifted off from the Yorktown and vanished into the clouds. Somewhere out there, beneath miles of water, their story remains. Not finished, not erased, only waiting. Because the sea keeps its secrets. But history, no matter how long it takes, keeps asking.